And we're back. Welcome to this week's episode of United Boxing, where we cover the fights from the United States and the United Kingdom. I'm boxing writer David Greisman, and I'm joined as always by British boxing broadcaster and analyst Darren Rees. This week I'm speaking to you from Las Vegas. I was here 2 months ago for the fights, and now I'm back for the food. It's funny, Darren, I've covered boxing for 20 years and I've traveled all around for it. But until this year, the only time I'd been to Vegas was way back in 2009, 15 years ago. And that was to cover the UFC rematch between George St. Pierre and BJ Penn. So that changed this August. The very first boxing match that I covered in Vegas was Virgil Ortiz versus Sergey Boachuk. And that was a rather entertaining introduction to the fights in this city. Darren, you've been around. What's on your bucket list for boxing coverage?
So I always wanted to go to Madison Square Garden for boxing, just because of, and I know there's been a few Madison Square Gardens, because of the history, and it's just iconic when it comes to the sport. And I've been as a spectator when Anthony Joshua was beaten by Andy Ruiz Jr. back in June 2019, and that was great. But I guess the dream is, as a broadcaster, to commentate live from ringside at MSG in New York City. But the other one is Vegas, and I've been to Vegas. It's a great city. It's a sort of place you can spend a hell of a lot of money, isn't it?
It sure is. I mean, just on the food and on the experiences. I think the other place that should be on everybody's list is going to the International Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota. I don't know if you had a chance to go there.
No, never went.
Well, I hope you make it there. One, as a broadcaster, to be inducted someday, and two, just to go check it out for induction weekend. But let's talk about this past weekend. We've got a whole lot to cover in this episode. We're going to be covering the big news from Artur Beterbiev's majority decision win over Dmitry Bivol for the undisputed light heavyweight championship. We'll be talking about the highlights from the undercard, which saw Skye Nicolson defend her featherweight title. Fabio Wardley ended his rivalry with Frazer Clarke with a huge exclamation point. And Ben Whittaker and Liam Cameron went over the top rope like it was the Royal Rumble. We'll also be previewing this upcoming weekend's junior middleweight title fight between Bakram Murtazaliev and Tim Tszyu. And we're going to be joined today by this week's guest, boxing writer Cliff Rold. Darren, Cliff is one of my oldest friends in boxing, so I'm very happy that we're going to have him on this week. He's covered the sport for, more than 20 years now. He spent 17 years with Boxing Scene, and he now runs his own Substack called The Corner Stool. Cliff is one of the go-to people for talking about boxing's lighter weight classes. So in addition to talking about Beterbiev versus Bivol, it'll be good to talk to him about the 7 title fights that took place in Japan, including a few of them that wrapped up just a few hours before we recorded this episode. That'll be later on, but we've got plenty of ground to cover first with our top topics, and that has to be Beterbiev versus Bivol. Darren, we are less than 48 hours after that fight ended. What did you think?
Well, should I tell you that I was so excited for this fight? I've been excited for it for a very long time, and I got my favourite takeaway. I got my favourite tipple. I was watching the undercard, which we'll talk about, which I was just loving life, just sat there watching these fights, especially ones like Wardley, Clarke and Nicholson versus Chapman, etc., thinking this is a good night of boxing with bizarre endings with Ben Whittaker and Liam Cameron giving us stuff to talk about. And then there was a bit of a break, wasn't there? And it all finished that undercard a little bit early because it was meant to be 11 p.m. UK time for the main event. And the next thing I knew, David, is I woke up on the sofa at 5 a.m. and I'd missed the fight.
No.
So the fight I had been looking forward to for years, we're not talking weeks or months, years, I didn't get to watch live because at some point I'd fallen asleep on the sofa.
Did you know the result then when you went to watch it, or did you at least get to watch it blind?
No, so I made sure I didn't. So I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, looked at my phone, was like, oh, no, I couldn't believe it. So I thought, I'm not going to look on social media. I'm not going to look on BoxRec. And I just got it on my laptop, rewound the pay-per-view, and then watched it from the very start. And for a boxing purist and somebody who really appreciates the technical aspect of the sport, the technical side of the sport, it was a masterclass from both, wasn't it?
It really was. It wasn't the most entertaining fight ever, but you could see their skills, and it was incredibly enjoyable to watch. What it may have lacked in terms of highlight reel action, I think that there was plenty of drama. There were twists and turns. You could truly appreciate their craft. The good thing about the result being this close is that we get to see it again. What did you think of the decision going to Beterbiev?
So I gave it to Bivol by a couple of rounds, but it was a close fight. It was a tight fight, and if it was a draw, I wouldn't have been too fussed. If Beterbiev did get the fight, he did get the decision in the end, didn't he? And I wasn't too wound up about that either. I don't think it was the robbery which some people believe that it was. I know that Eddie Hearn has been extremely vocal, and of course he will be because Bivol's his man, and that's kind of the role that he plays, isn't it? But maybe 116, 112 was a little bit favoriting Beterbiev. That's 8 rounds to 4. What do you think about that scorecard in particular?
I don't agree with that scorecard, but if that scorecard was 115, 113 for Beterbiev, like the other judge had it, I don't know that people would be claiming robbery as much. The outcry over the result and the result itself reminded me of a quote from my favorite comedian. I don't know if you're familiar with George Carlin, but the late, great George Carlin once had a line, undisputed heavyweight champion. Well, if it's undisputed, what's all the fighting about? Here we have this fight for the undisputed light heavyweight championship. And you can say right now that Artur Beterbiev is the undisputed light heavyweight champion, but there's still dispute about it. Even if this was a close but competitive fight, I think right now we don't just have one king. We still have two claimants to the throne. It just happens to be that Beterbiev is sitting on the throne right now. I think that it was a close fight that could have gone either way. Dmitry Bivol absolutely elevated himself with his performance. It was one of his finest performances against a top-level opponent, up there with the Canelo fight, but in there with a true 175-pounder, somebody who was still very good at 39 years of age in Artur Beterbiev. I thought that Bivol took the first few rounds. I was surprised that he didn't fade later on. He seemed to be tiring out at one point, and we know that Beterbiev can get stronger. But in that 9th round, that was Dmitry Bivol coming on. But there were a few things that stood out to me for why the fight ended up going in Beterbiev's direction. There were a few rounds that Dmitry Bivol started off very strong, controlled the first half of the round, the first 2 minutes. But then that second half of the round or the final minute belonged to Artur Beterbiev. And when he was landing with some clean, eye-catching shots. And I think that might have stuck with the judges. But the other thing that happened is that the final 2 rounds in particular belonged to Artur Beterbiev. So when the fight truly was on the line on the scorecards, it was Beterbiev who was coming on, and those 2 rounds delivered the victory to him.
I think this fight surprised me in a way because lots of people expected Beterbiev to catch up with Bivol at some point. You were one of them. You said it's not a case of where, it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. But what Bivol did really well is he boxed clever, pun intended, and he was very good at riding the punches, and he was very good at kind of just seeing those pockets of storms through, because there were moments when Beterbiev looked like he was getting on top of him and he was unleashing a barrage of shots, and Bivol would kind of soak them up or change the angle and make sure that they weren't being as impactful as they could be if he just stood there and let him hit him with them. But also, he did that whilst mixing it up with Beterbiev as well, which I thought was quite impressive. And he could have, for the whole 12 rounds, just been on the back foot because he punches straight and he punches hard a lot of the time. He could have just danced around and just tried to win the fight like that. Now there was plenty of that, because that is what he is very good at. But I did really like to see that he was standing there and he was trading with him a bit, and there was some good body work, throwing a lot of hooks to the body, a lot of hooks upstairs, even the odd uppercut, which you don't see too much from Bivol. But it really was 2 fighters at the top of their game. Now, this fight, David, had a lot of eyes on it. the majority of the eyes were people like you and I who live and breathe boxing and work in the sport. But the promotion that went into this and the money which was pumped into it was obviously there to try and catch what I would say is the average Joe, like other sports fans. How do you think other sports fans would have reacted to watching that fight? Because there wasn't 5 knockdowns and chaos galore, was there? It was just a technically fantastic bout.
I think that had the fight been more of a war, obviously it would do more for those fans. But I think it was still enjoyable enough. Going to what you were saying, Bivol boxed, but he didn't run. He engaged. It was very entertaining to watch the craft of what he does in a way that negates what Beterbiev was doing, but not in a negative way for us fans to watch. Just to draw the difference between some fighters who can negate their opponents and it's just dreary and dreadful. I thought that Bivol's craft, the small things, were just so great to see, and his chin held up. We know that he got hurt by Joe Smith. We know that Artur Beterbiev has come on and hurt an Anthony Yard, Marcus Brown, Alexander Gvozdyk, but Bivol took those shots when they did land, and Beterbiev did land a couple of good things in there. I just was very impressed by that. As for the scoring, that's the kind of thing that when there's a narrative that boxing is corrupt, that the judging is bad, that's the kind of thing that can turn off more casual fans. And so I do get a little bit worried when the narrative becomes, oh, this was a robbery, or how could this decision have gone that way? With the caveat that I did not score this fight live, I want to say that when you have close rounds, what we call swing rounds, you should mark those down. So that if you scored on your scorecard at the end of the fight, you had it 115, 113 for Bivol, but you noticed that there were 2 close rounds that could have gone to Beterbiev, that creates an acceptable range of scores. Darren, what did you think?
So I think one of the outcomes, or the outcome which there was 2 outcomes which people didn't really see happening. One of those was Dmitry Bivol winning by stoppage, which didn't happen and didn't look like it was going to happen really at any point. And the other one that nobody really saw coming was Beterbiev winning on points. Because I think most people thought if Beterbiev was going to win this fight, then he was going to win it inside the distance, and it would be 21 fights, 21 wins, 21 stoppages. So the fact that he went on and proved that he can win a fight on the cards and go the 12-round distance and look good doing so, and I know he was the fighter who had to put his foot on the gas at the end, and especially in the last 2 to 3 rounds, was impressive. But that judge, the one that scored it 116, 112, I had a look into that judge as a Polish judge. And I thought, I wonder if there's any history there. I wonder if there's anything in the past where that judge has made a bit of a boo-boo and there's a bit of a theme which goes along with that. And there isn't. He's a top judge. He was one of the judges for Naoya Inoue's most recent fights against TJ Doheny. He's done many, many world title fights. And I think on BoxRec, it shows that he's been a judge for something like 2,500 bouts. So he is an extremely experienced judge. And I know this from the fortunate position which I'm in a lot of the time, is sometimes fights up close from a particular place near the ring look very different to when you watch them on TV. I don't know why. They just do. The amount of times I've been ringside watching fights and then I've gone on to Twitter to go and see what some of my friends and colleagues are saying, and they're thinking the complete opposite to me. And I'm thinking, how does that work out? Or do I not know what I'm talking about? Have you experienced that as a journalist who's been a few feet away?
There have been some fights where my opinion is very different from what other people see is going on. And sometimes that's a matter of what we see or don't see. And sometimes that's a matter of expectation. So going to what you're saying about this judge and you're not seeing any additional red flags, I think that we need to take note of this judge's name. And if there are more outliers in the future, then maybe we can have questions. But maybe this was just them having a different perspective, literally and figuratively. Or maybe this was a bad night at the office. But again, this didn't change the result. If it had been one round better, if it had been 115, 113, sure, there's still people who saw Dmitry Bivol winning and they'd be upset or complaining about that. But to me, I'm okay with the result. Just looking at some of the other journalists who had this fight or how they had this fight, Tris Dixon, the editor-in-chief of Boxing Scene, had it 115, 113 for Beterbiev. Adam Abramowitz of Saturday Night Boxing had it 114, 114 a draw. Cliff Rold, who we'll be talking to shortly, he had it for Bivol. That sounds about right. That's an acceptable range right there. So now we have Artur Beterbiev as the undisputed champion. We've got Dmitry Bivol still there as the clear contender. And the good news is that we could get an immediate rematch. Or, if not an immediate rematch, a rematch soon. This fight itself was financed by Turki Al Sheikh and Riyadh Season. He said afterward that he didn't agree with the score, which means that he wants to pump some more money in and get this fight again. Now, the difficult thing is when you have an undisputed champion, you've got all 4 world titles, you owe fights to your mandatory challengers. The other good news, though, is that 2 of those mandatory challengers, David Benavidez and David Morrell, are going to be fighting each other, it looks like, in January. And then another mandatory contender is Joshua Buatsi. I don't know if they want to put him in with either of these guys just yet. Are there any other fights at light heavyweight that you'd want to see, or is the rematch the thing that stands out to you most?
So normally I'm not a huge fan of immediate rematches unless there's an absolute need to. But not only is there an absolute need to in this case because it was so good and it was such a compelling fight to watch, but also I think if we wait another couple of years and they have another couple of fights in between, Beterbiev will be 41 years old. And then you'll have all these different excuses around Beterbiev was, 2 years is a lot when you get to that sort of age and you're a professional athlete. And I just want to squash all of that stuff. And I'd like to see them just get straight back to it in February, March, if that's enough time, maybe a tiny bit later, and do it all over again. What about yourself?
Yeah, I'd love to see it sooner. I know that there may be an in-between bout for Beterbiev. He hasn't been the most active in recent years. This is the first time, I think, since 2021 he's had 2 fights in 1 year. He will be turning, I think, 40 in January. So the sooner the better, especially because I don't want there to be any excuses that this fight is happening too late. Obviously, this fight could have happened a long time ago. Beterbiev is still performing at a high enough level to go the 12-round distance and win a close fight over Bivol. But the longer that this takes to get them in the ring again, the more tainted that result might be. So let's get these guys in while they're still clearly number 1 and 2. Let's move on, if we can, to the undercard. As has been the case with many of these stacked shows, there was a whole lot to talk about. First and foremost, I can't even say first and foremost just because there was so much. But let's talk about Jay Opetaia defending his cruiserweight championship, the lineal championship, and his world title against Jack Massey. What did you think of that result, and what do you want to have happen next?
So I said last week, and this isn't I told you so, but Jay Opetaia is a serious operator. He is one of the most determined fighters out there, and I thought he'd be too much for Jack Massey, and that's exactly what he was. Massey gave it everything. He left everything in the ring. He put his heart and soul into every shot which he threw, and he really did. He really did try. But I thought that Joe Gallagher was right to get involved and pull him out of the fight. And I guess Chris Billam-Smith's got to come through Zurdo, and then that fight between Jay Opetaia and Chris Billam-Smith can happen. And I hope that can happen in the UK because that will be a real good atmosphere for that one, especially with Chris's fan base. So for those in the US who aren't too aware of Chris, maybe, or how football and boxing come together, is a lot of good boxers have been clever and they've linked themselves to football clubs because in their fan base then goes along with the fighter. So that it's happened like with Ricky Hatton and Manchester City. So when he fought Floyd Mayweather, you'll remember Floyd Mayweather coming out with that Manchester United top, and lots of fighters have done it, like Josh Warrington with Leeds, and Chris Billam-Smith. He's from Bournemouth, and Bournemouth AFC are in the Premiership or the Premier League even. And the fans they're massive on Chris Billam-Smith. So it's the sort of fight which could end up at the Vitality Stadium. And I was lucky enough to be there when Chris Billam-Smith beat Lawrence Okoli to win that WBO cruiserweight title. So that's what I hope happens with that one. But yeah, it went as expected.
Yeah, and so Billam-Smith has that November fight versus Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez. That'll be a unification bout. We were just talking with the light heavyweights about mandatory challengers, and unfortunately, Opetaia owes a mandatory to a really undeserving challenger. So it'll be interesting to see whether he takes that fight or if he forgoes the IBF belt to try to make a unification bout with the winner of Billam-Smith versus Ramirez. I wonder, though, if he forgoes that belt and can't immediately come to terms with either Billam-Smith or Ramirez, does he lose leverage given the fact that it wouldn't be a unification bout anymore? He'd still be the lineal champ, but those belts, in a way, still do matter. Time will tell with that. We have seen with the IBF just some of these titles get vacated just because the champion doesn't want to face the mandatory challenger. Canelo getting rid of the IBF instead of William Skoll. And not to malign Daniel Dubois, but I understood why Alexander Usyk got rid of the IBF title, given that he owed the mandatory rematch to Tyson Fury instead of facing Dubois in a rematch of that fight. Let's talk about Ben Whittaker versus Liam Cameron. What a weird ending to that fight. From what it seems to me, that Whittaker was in a competitive fight, maybe was in trouble depending on your perspective, and then they clinch and Whittaker got pushed or maybe pulled Cameron over the top rope, got injured, got taken out on a wheelchair. You were watching. What happened?
Well, it was bizarre, and I guess rewind a moment. Ben Whittaker had the most challenging opponent that he's had in his professional career so far. He is very entertaining to a lot of people, and going back to our Marmite theme, he is certainly a Marmite character. And he's been like it even when he was in the amateurs. So I remember seeing sparring of him when he was sparring Felix Cash. I think he was a European champion then, and he was doing all of his flashy stuff then. And when you're fighting away corner fighters, as I like to call them, it's pretty easy to do that stuff when you've got the skill set that he has. Then all of a sudden, he had Liam Cameron in front of him who wasn't going to stand for it. And there was a little bit of flashy stuff, but he was getting caught, and he was getting caught a lot. And I think a lot of people in the arena, and I know some of my colleagues who were there, had it very, very close by the time that it got to the fifth round. And then for those who didn't see it, both of them went over the ropes and crashed onto the ring apron. And Liam Cameron gets up, and there's a few words which are being said, and Liam Cameron is sure that someone from the Whittaker team had told him to stay down for whatever reason, allegedly anyway. But I was looking at the British Boxing Board of Control rules, and it says if an accidental foul causes an injury severe enough for the referee to stop the bout immediately after 4 rounds have occurred, then the bout will result in a technical decision awarded to the boxer who is ahead on the scorecards at the time. And then at the time, one judge scored it 58-57 for Whittaker. The other had it for Cameron by the same margin. And then the third had it level at 58-58. And lots of people are like, I've never seen anything like this happen before. Well, it has happened before, and it happened at a world-famous York Hall in Bethnal Green. And that was a cruiserweight English title fight between Lawrence Bennett and Matty Askins. All hell broke loose after the fight, and it ended in a technical draw. But that was in the first round, and both of them went through the ropes, and Matty Askin had to go away because he had severe bruising on both his back and on his ribs as well. But have you ever seen anything like that before?
There have been 2 fights that have ended with somebody going over the top rope. Again, going back to the Royal Rumble theme, there was most famously the heavyweight fight between Riddick Bowe and Elijah Tillery, 30-something years ago, where Tillery kicked, I'm not kidding, kicked Riddick Bowe. They tied up. There was some outside interference from Bowe's manager. Again, sounds like wrestling, and they both got pulled over the top rope. And then just earlier this year, there's a heavyweight journeyman named Curtis Harper fought a guy named Caleb Slaughter, and they tussled within the first minute of the fight, and Slaughter pushed Harper over the top rope, and that ended as a disqualification. But this is the first time in a long time that we've had this kind of incident, and then beyond that, to have the fight end that way with Whittaker being taken out on a wheelchair. I saw some people on social media accuse Whittaker of quitting, thinking that maybe he was playing up the injury to get out of a fight that was tougher than he thought it was going to be. Do you think that that's a fair accusation?
I think that's an accusation which is naturally going to occur when you've got a character like Whittaker, especially when he wasn't getting it all of his own way. Do I think that he was genuinely hurt? Personally, yes, I do. But you can see how people come to these conclusions and how they start to put pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together in their own heads. But you got to think like he's 6'1", something like that, and going over that top rope backwards and landing on a hard surface. Like there's every reason for him to be hurt, especially when you've got Liam Cameron who's kind of tumbling on top of you as well. But can I see why people are saying those things? Yes.
As they've said way too many times in the WWE, that is the hardest part of the canvas. And it's not like the boxing ring has been designed to be anywhere near as forgiving as wrestling rings are. Not that wrestling rings are great to be body slammed on. Well,
Exactly.
Yeah. Also on the undercard, Skye Nicolson won a unanimous decision over Raven Chapman. How was her performance? She won a unanimous decision, but in your eyes, did she put on the kind of performance that you thought she needed to?
Yeah, she did. I said last week that Raven Chapman is the more aggressive, the more she's the come forward fighter. She's got one gear and she's got one mode, and that is she looks at you and she hunts you down and she doesn't stop until she gets you. That's what she's like. I called her fight previous to one with Skye against a Colombian fighter called Solarado or something like that. But this Colombian lady was super, super tough, and Chapman just stalked her for every minute of every round. And she tried to do that with Skye Nicolson, but the Olympian Skye Nicolson was out in full force on Saturday night, and she was super slick. She was light on her toes, and she was counter punching perfectly. And she was just too good. She was just far too good. And that was a good example of how technically brilliant fighters will almost always find a way to win a fight on points in situations like that.
We were talking earlier in this episode about the Beterbiev versus Bivol fight and whether that would appeal to casual fans. With Skye Nicolson's obvious skill, but also her style, do you think that she can cross over and become a star, given that she is a master boxer and not necessarily an action fighter?
That's a good question. It's a hard question to answer. So I think she's watchable because she is slick and she's classy, but also she's good outside of the ring as well. So she's a really good talker, and she talks up a fight, and she plays a little bit of a villain as well. She knows how to kind of wind up some members of the audience like she was doing, and being very confident when it came to the press conference and the weigh-in and all that kind of stuff. And I think that that stuff combined can make her a little bit more watchable. Maybe because some people will want to see her get beaten as much as other people will want to watch her and her slick skills. But just one more on Raven Chapman. I was watching an interview with Frank Warren and Radio Raheem earlier on Seconds Out. Really good interview. Go and check it out. About 45 minutes for those who haven't watched it. And Frank says, Raven's our girl. She's the Queen of Queensbury because she was the first ever. She the first ever, I think, or she's one of the first fighters to be signed to Queensbury from the women's side of the sport. And he wants to deliver her dream and try and help her become a world champion. So I really hope that comes true for her, because she's someone who deserves it and puts in a hell of a lot of work.
I think Raven will get that opportunity, given that 2 of the 4 world titles at featherweight are still held by Amanda Serrano. But I don't know that Amanda Serrano ever has any intention of returning to 126. Her next fight, which is going to be on the undercard of Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson, is going to be at 140, and that's the rematch with Katie Taylor. As for Nicolson, looks like her next fight is going to be against Tiara Brown, who is her mandatory challenger. Brown was supposed to be facing Diana Vargas, somebody that Nicolson had previously beat in a fight this weekend in Philadelphia for the interim WBC title. Vargas had visa issues. That fight's been postponed, but Nicholson said in a post-fight interview that she wants Tiara Brown next. Tiara Brown actually used to be a police officer in my town in Washington, D.C., was very well renowned. So it's been fun to also follow her boxing career. We'll see what happens if and when she lands that fight with Nicholson. But let's move on to one of the most sensational moments from this undercard, and that was the rematch between Fabio Wardley and Frazer Clarke. Earlier this year, they had such an entertaining 12-round battle. And then here we are in the rematch, and it ends in less than one round with Fabio Wardley just destroying Clarke, sending him to the hospital with a dent in his face and what appeared to be a dislocated jaw. Wow, that was huge. What were you thinking watching that?
So that was, if you could bolt on a 13th round to the first fight, then that's almost like the perfect ending, if that makes sense. Because I don't know if the first fight really deserved to end in a draw for either of the guys because of how entertaining and how much they both put into it. But it was some shot, wasn't it? And I think Frazer Clarke said afterwards that he said, fair play to Fabio. I haven't got I'm paraphrasing here. He put a tweet out, or Gareth Davies, one of the journos in the UK, had put something out to say that he'd bumped into Frazer Clarke, and he said, fair play to Fabio Wardley. He says, I've been around the block. And he has, he was an Olympian. He would have gone to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. He would have gone to deepest, darkest parts of the Soviet Union. He would have fought some real tough characters. He said, I've never been hit as hard as he hit me. And it was, I tell you, one of the things which straight away vividly comes back to me from watching that fight on Saturday is I can hear myself screaming at the referee to stop it when Frazer Clarke is pretty much like on one knee, and you could see like the dent in his head where he's got that fractured bone in his head, and he looked like he was having a stroke, and it looked really, really scary. But I said last week, or maybe it was a week before, 2 years ago, if I'd asked you, could Daniel Dubois be the IBF heavyweight champion of the world after that defeat from Joe Joyce when his eye socket went, you would have said, Darren, how many beers have you had today? Exactly the same thing with Fabio Wardley. With a performance like that, in a year's time, in 18 months' time, why couldn't there be a heavyweight championship of the world between Fabio Wardley and Daniel Dubois? And why couldn't Fabio Wardley become the man?
What a big win, and over an Olympic medalist at that. We were talking the other week about how hot the heavyweight division is right now and how much of that is heavyweights in the United Kingdom. So, we look at what Daniel Dubois could be doing next. Do you think that that's where Fabio Wardley goes, or is there somebody else in the division that you'd like to see Wardley in with?
There's so many good fighters, isn't there? Like domestically and on the way up as well. I'd quite like to see Fabio Wardley versus Johnny Fisher. And I know Johnny Fisher's going to fight Dave Allen, which I think is just a bit of a fight for what I would like to describe as like the pub fans. I think Johnny Fisher will destroy Dave Allen. But I think Fish is proving to be a good contender at heavyweight. And if Fabio Wardley can knock somebody like him out in the same sort of fashion that he did with Frazer Clarke, then it's yet again another highlight reel knockout. Yet again, it's a statement and somebody who lots of people rate, and it helps build his profile and it helps build the picture and it builds the narrative of him making his way up and then eventually getting towards that kind of pre-world level and then eventually that world level. Don't get it twisted. I don't think Fabio Wardley will be fighting for a world title in 6 months, but in 18 months to 2 years, I reckon he could.
And no matter what, he's must-see. As with so many of these other heavyweights, you know that if you're watching Fabio Wardley now, you just can't blink. Let's wrap up with the one last major fight from the undercard, and that was Chris Eubank stopping Camilo Zarameta. Don't know how much we need to talk about the fight, so much as really what comes next. We'd been wondering whether Chris Eubank could end up hosting Canelo Alvarez in 2025 in a fight at super middleweight. That still might happen. We're wondering, could Eubank face Hamza Shiraz, rising 160-pound contender? But it looks like Instead, we could get the fight that was supposed to happen a couple years ago, the fight between Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn. What do you think of that?
I think it's a fight which has got to happen just because of the history. And again, because of the narrative with their fathers fighting and all that stuff, it just captures the general public's imagination in a big way, doesn't it? Conor Benn hasn't done himself any favours, and he's kind of made himself public enemy number one with all of the accusations around the performance enhancing drug stuff. I think I said to you in one of our first ever episodes that he was someone who was building himself to become a very likable character who was on like all the mainstream huge like Good Morning Britain programs and millions of viewers and all that kind of stuff. But since that's happened, he's almost become the bad guy. It's almost like bad guy versus bad guy, actually, and it's definitely Marmite versus Marmite. But some people love Eubank and hate him, and it's exactly the same with Conor Benn. But both of them are such good salesmen, and whether they really hate each other as much as they make out they do, I don't know. But yeah, I wonder what weight you would be at.
I mean, I think it has to be maybe like 154 or even closer, like 158. I don't know what Eubank can make in terms of weight. We'll see what happens. If you couldn't tell by the tone of my voice, I'm not thrilled about this fight. I don't like it when athletes cheat in general, and I don't like it when athletes get rewarded for cheating. And the fact that Conor Benn, 2+ years after that fight got canceled, the fight is perhaps even bigger than it would have been because of the additional storyline in there. It's akin to if Ryan Garcia ends up facing Devin Haney again, or even anybody else. But as you said, it perhaps has to happen because aside from Canelo Alvarez for Eubank Jr., that fight with Ben is the biggest money fight for him. And the fight with Eubank is obviously the biggest money fight for Ben. There's a line that I sometimes use when there are two teams or two athletes that I really don't like. And there was this opening scene in the Dark Knight Rises, the Batman movie, where Bane, the villain, sets off an explosion underneath of a football stadium and both teams fall within. And this is one of those fights. Obviously, I don't want any harm to actually come, but I want both guys to lose. As you said, Marmite versus Marmite. We're still holding out for the Marmite sponsorship.
We need to get someone from Team Marmite to get in contact. I can see, I completely get, and I see your point, and I felt like that really strongly when it came to Jarrell Miller, because of how cocky he was after all of that and how he didn't really show any remorse in any way. So to see him getting rewarded with like hundreds and hundreds of £1,000 paydays when he, like cheated beyond belief and the evidence was incredible, that hurts to see that kind of thing. And also because it's Brit versus Brit, boxing fans so if I said to someone like my uncle, who's not a massive boxing fan but used to watch the fights in the 80s and the 90s, he will vividly be able to tell me what happened in those Eubank and Ben fights because it was on terrestrial television back in those days. So the history is deep enough for the narrative to be refreshed and come alive again. But anyway, that's enough on that. Well, I believe we're going to see that in February, 2 weeks time, I've been told, and there'll be an announcement. So that's apparently going to be, and this is just rumours, apparently going to be on top of the next 5v5 stuff.
Well, those are our thoughts on this past weekend's action. Let's hear what Cliff Rold had to say about Beterbiev versus Bivol and about the 7 title fights in Japan.
Well, I think I saw someone else tweet this, and I thought it was a good summary. We waited years and years to find out who the best light heavyweight in the world is, and we still kind of don't. There's plenty of debate about who won the fight. I don't think that the decision was unjust, though I thought Bivol won the fight 7-5. Beterbiev came on really strong in the second half of the fight. I thought Bivol won the first 4 or 5 rounds of the fight. I think I scored the first 5 for Bivol. But there were a couple of swing rounds in there. And on the back end of the fight, there were more decisive rounds for Beterbiev. And most importantly, I thought the last 2 rounds were decisive. All 3 judges gave the last 3 rounds to Beterbiev. But I thought in particular, the last 2 rounds, Bivol just stopped throwing punches. He seemed to be hurt in the 11th round, and Beterbiev couldn't quite put him away. I thought that Beterbiev could have fought him better. I thought in the 11th he had a chance to stop him, but he didn't throw the right hand to the body enough. Every time he landed the right hand to the body, Bivol went into retreat, and Beterbiev was able to amplify his offense. I thought that Beterbiev could have done less headhunting in the last 2 rounds. I thought he had an opportunity to potentially stop Bivol in the 11th, but he didn't go to the body enough. And it would have made for a more decisive outcome. But at the end of the day, after 7 years, we finally saw the fight. It was a good fight. It wasn't a great fight. It wasn't a classic, but it was a good fight. It was a good, honest effort from both guys, and I'm glad we got to see it.
Yeah, I think that while Artur Beterbiev is the undisputed champion right now, there still is dispute. There still are 2 guys who have legitimate claims to the throne. Like you, I thought that it was a very close bout with a number of swing rounds where Bivol might have started a round strong, and then Beterbiev came back and finished that round even stronger, and he definitely finished the fight stronger. With that said, even though Bivol gave up some rounds, I thought it was one of his best performances ever.
I agree. I thought there were spots where Bivol fought very well. One of the things that hurt him, though, is there were these moments in the fight where Beterbiev would start to land, and Bivol would go into retreat and not throw punches for extended periods of time. I wonder how that impacted the judges. Here's another thing I wonder about. Some fights sound different and look different when you're so close to the ring. And Beterbiev hits so hard that when you're right under the ropes as one of the judges, is there something that is missed when you're watching on television, when you're watching from out in the crowd, that those judges are picking up that you can't? And in a fight like this that was close on the scorecards, I think sometimes we undercut the fact that the judges have a distinctly different view of the physicality of the fight. And because of that, maybe there's something that the audience is missing that the judges could see that they could, for the people who are adamant that they thought Bivol won the fight.
You and I both agree that the fight could have gone either way, but what did you think of that one judge who had it 116, 112 for Beterbiev?
I thought he gave Beterbiev too much credit, but I had the fight 7-5 for Bivol. I think there were enough swing rounds. There were at least 3 swing rounds on my card. If you swing all 3 of those rounds to Beterbiev, it's an 8-4 fight. So that is not out of pocket. I think people get carried away, like people who have the fight 7-5 for Beterbiev and go, oh, I can't believe they gave him 8 rounds. You can't? Really? I mean, I think we overreact sometimes on the margins too much. I mean, look, if you have a fight, the way that Adelaide Byrd had Canelo and Golovkin the first time, where it's 10-2 for Canelo in a fight where basically everybody else thought that Alvarez won 8-4 or that Golovkin won 8-4, that's pretty preposterous. But, this wasn't that. And I think people get carried away on margins sometimes because they feel like, well, he did more than an 8-4 loss. Well, maybe he did, but that doesn't mean that 8-4 is an impossible scorecard.
I think even if the scores hadn't been in dispute, there would be reason for a second fight. How do you feel about a rematch, and should that rematch be immediate?
I'd love to see an immediate rematch. If for no other reason than time is not on their side to make the rematch. It took 7 years to make this fight. They were 33 and 39 going into the ring on Saturday. Beterbiev isn't getting any younger, and Beterbiev is also, let's be frank, he's almost 40 years old. He gets hurt between every fight almost, it seems like. We're lucky we saw him fight twice in 1 calendar year for the first time in forever. If you're going to do this fight again, go ahead and do it. It is the most significant rivalry of this era at light heavyweight. And by era, I mean the post-Kovalev and Stevenson and Ward years. These are the 2 preeminent light heavyweights. I think the winner of Benavidez and Morrell will give them a number 1 contender. If Beterbiev decided to fight Benavidez or Morrell next instead of Bivol, I'd be okay with that. But if they fought each other again, I would also be okay with that. I think the second fight might be even better. It might be more decisive. Bivol, could he box that way technically again? Beterbiev seems like the kind of guy who it would be real hard not to get knocked out if you had to spend 24 rounds with him. So, there's some intrigue there. Could he stop Bivol? Could Bivol, mount more offense and retreat a little less? I mean, there are technical questions there. But if Benavidez beats Morrell and he jumps the line and gets to fight Beterbiev, I don't know if you can come up with a much better action fight than Beterbiev and Benavidez.
I love that fight. And I love that fight given where they both are in their careers. As you mentioned, Beterbiev is getting a little long in the tooth. He's turning 40 in January. He's had some injuries. Did you see any signs of Beterbiev slipping? I mean, he won, but how did he look compared to how he looked in the past, with the caveat that he was in with Dmitry Bivol, who made him look worse than before?
I thought he looked like Beterbiev. I didn't notice any slippage at all. I thought he responded well to whatever has come off of the knee injury. I thought he boxed well, he pressured well. He looked like Beterbiev to me. That's the thing, is he's aged. I've never seen a moment where I'm like, boy, he sure looks a lot different. Now, maybe if I went back and watched his fights with Cloud again or Campillo from early in his career, I would notice more distinctly a difference in speed. I noticed that the other day. Like, I've seen so many fights over the years, Shane Mosley and Oscar De La Hoya, Shane Mosley and Vernon Forrest, and then you go back and watch some early highlights of him at lightweight and you're like, oh my God, I forgot how fast he was. Like, he was so much faster when he first turned professional. And you can forget, because as time moves on and athletes slip, you remember more your last impression of them. You go back and watch Lady Vander Holyfield, right? He's still a thriller, but he's not a 100 punch around guy. His speed has declined. And so you remember more that late heavyweight version of him than that younger version that fought Michael Dokes and stuff. So same thing here. Maybe if I go back and watch it, but from just, my impression this weekend, he didn't look old to me. He didn't look faded to me. He looked like Beterbiev, but that could also change quickly. Here's another suggestion, though, and I'm going to throw this out because I think it is an interesting idea. Kyle McLaughlin at Combat Chronicles, one of the better historians in the world in terms of boxing, made the suggestion, and it's kind of out of pocket, but he said, going back to their amateur rivalry, what if Beterbiev moved up in the old-fashioned sense, right? Like light heavyweight champions used to move up and challenge heavyweights all the time. What if we did Beterbiev and Usyk, and you brought these two longtime rivals back from the amateur days and let them finish their careers against each other? I'd be interested in that too. I'd love to see what the pressure of Beterbiev could do against Usyk. I know it sounds crazy to people because they're like 40 pounds apart right now, but we've had stranger fights before. I mean, Billy Conn was outweighed by 31 pounds by Joe Louis, and they gave us one of the great fights of all time. So I'll throw that out there too. I'd be interested in that as well.
Now, Cliff, I, of course, have to talk to you about all these fights that we had in Japan these past 2 days. We had, 8 fights in total that were on ESPN2, never mind some others, including 7 title fights. What to you were the maybe 2 or 3 big takeaways from these cards?
I think one of the big takeaways is that you can't manufacture a narrative in boxing. That's the difference between boxing and MMA and professional wrestling, which are all sort of kissing cousins of one another. In pro wrestling, Junto Nakatani would be fighting Takuma Inoue to set up a story with Naoya Inoue. That didn't play out that way. If Nakatani is going to unify at bantamweight, he's going to have to go through some other fighters instead. I hope he still does that. I think Nakatani is clearly the class of bantamweight right now, and Inoue is, of course, the undisputed champion at 122, the first in history. I think that's going to be a tremendous 2026. I would like to see Nakatani get another big fight before then, if not a unification fight with one of the guys at 118. I would love to see Bam Rodriguez versus Nakatani fight you can make in the sport. And in that spread from 115 to 122, you have 3 of arguably the top 10 fighters in the world in any weight class. And I would love to see them mix and match any way they can.
So what you're talking about is, before the fight, we had heard that Nakatani had agreed that he would face his fellow bantamweight title holder, Takuma Inoue. And if that fight was to happen and Nakatani was to win, he would then move up to 122 to face Takuma's older brother, Naoya Inoue. But as we saw, Takuma Inoue lost to Seiya Tsutsumi, while Nakatani was able to win his fight against Petch CP Freshmart. Were you surprised Takuma Inoue lost?
I was not surprised Takuma Inoue lost. Takuma Inoue is a good fighter. That's it. and good fighters can lose to other good fighters. In any family of athletes, there is usually one alpha, and there is a clear alpha in the Inoue family. Takuma is a very good fighter, really tough. His fight with Tsutsumi was fantastic, one of the fights of the year, but he doesn't have the power, and he doesn't have the all-around skill set to be more than a good fighter, and so he's beatable. We've seen him beaten before. We saw him beaten again. It doesn't surprise me to see him lose to anyone at 118 pounds.
But Nakatani, meanwhile, seems to be the class of 118. And as you mentioned, there is, of course, the storyline. Can Nakatani go up to 122 for that big fight with Inoue? But you mentioned, the class of 115, which is Jesse, Bam, Rodriguez. There are a lot of options available for Nakatani. All the title holders in Japan all the title holders at 118 are from Japan. And then, of course, Bam isn't, but that is a big fight that would be made. Are you excited at all for any of the other bantamweights for Nakatani, or is it basically Bam, Inoue, or bust?
Well, and I posted this on X earlier. The Nakatani's record right now is 29-0. The combined record of the other three bantamweight champions right now is 31-0-2. So you have a unique situation where none of the other bantamweight champions have more than 12 wins right now. Tsutsumi has the most with 12. I would love to see him fight any of them because they are the cream of the class right now. Not having a lot of fights is not an obstacle to being an elite fighter, especially in the lower weight classes. We've seen that over the year. But I think there are more interesting opponents than any of the other bantamweight titleists. I think Bam is an interesting opponent. That said, I'd like to see Bam fight Fernando Martinez before he moves up to 118 as well. So you have a plethora of fights you can make there. I would absolutely love to see Tsutsumi, though, and Nakatani. I think that's an excellent fight. I think it would be an exciting fight. And whatever gets us to Nakatani and Inoue, because I don't think any of the obstacles at 118 currently stop that from being the eventual destination. I don't think there's anyone at 122 right now who can beat Inoue, but I do think Nakatani and Inoue is interesting because Nakatani, despite being the man moving up in weight, may ultimately be the bigger man in the ring against Inoue. When you factor in his frame, his length, he's going to grow into that weight class. And Inoue is getting older, and Nakatani is at the peak of his powers. It's a fascinating clash between a fighter who may be closer to the end of his prime than most realize, and one who's in the full flush of his. It's an excellent fight, but I would like to see it marinate with one or two more fights and be the super fight it should be in 2026.
Where does Chocolatito Roman Gonzalez fit into this picture?
Nowhere, really. I think Chocolatito, if he could get a title shot at 115 or at 118, there are some people he could fight. I think Fernando Martinez and Chocolatito would be fascinating. I think for the sheer history of it, although I would strongly favor Bam Rodriguez to win, Bam versus Chocolatito, if Bam could eliminate all four of the hardcore four, that is a real feather in his cap. And I think there would be some strength to that for his career. He's also got some quality young wins like Sonny Edwards. So I think Chocolatito could fit in there. I think Chocolatito could fit in with any of the other three bantamweight titleists. I would not necessarily be a fan of watching Nakatani and Chocolatito at this point. Chocolatito is close to 40, a lot of wear on his tires. I think Nakatani would hurt him. I don't know that the other three would hurt him. I think he'd be a live dog in against all three of the other bantamweight champions.
There were 6 other fights on these doubleheaders. Were there any other standout performances or standout fights that people who didn't watch the show should look up?
Well, we talked about Inoue and Tsutsumi. I think people should watch that. It's Fight of the Year candidate. I think people should go out of their way to see Kenshiro Taraji and Christopher Rosales, only because Taraji really is a special talent. Kenshiro is one of the best fighters in the world. He managed to be the man at 108 pounds. At a time when 108 has been a relatively undersung but very strong division. It's been a good era for that weight class. Not Carvajal, Gonzalez, Yu, and Chang. Not those years. It's not that strong, but it's been a relatively strong weight class. I'm glad to see him at flyweight. It gives flyweight a star fighter. The division has not really been all that interesting since outside of a brief flurry recently where Sonny Edwards and Bam Rodriguez were able to fight. Flyweight's been kind of quiet since Chocolatito and Estrada left. And I always like to see any of the classic weight classes have somebody there that kind of gives it an extra dimension. Kenshiro provides that to 112. Rosales, always a good, tough fighter. Not a great fighter, but a good one. That's another good win for Kenshiro. And hopefully he can add a couple more. Again, another fighter who is aging, but this really has been a golden age for boxing in Japan. You've had Inoue. You've had Kazuto Ioka. You've had Kenshiro. This is and now you have Nakatani. It's a very special era for one of the strongest and most vibrant countries for the lower weight classes over the last 60 years. So it's been a lot of fun.
This is increasingly a global sport, and you and I have both seen how much easier it is for fans to follow fights from pretty much anywhere in the world at this point. This, however, is a podcast focusing on boxing in the UK and in the US. Why should British and American fight fans care as much as you and I do about these lighter weight classes that are primarily taking place in Japan and elsewhere?
Because great boxing happens everywhere. And if you love boxing, you should seek out great boxing. And we live in an era where we can see things that we never saw before. In terms of the viewing potential, this is a bit of a golden era for boxing. It's not a golden era in the United States in terms of the overall market, the number of stars, but in terms of the ability of a boxing fan to see anything in the world live. Like, you don't have to wait for it to be posted on YouTube later on, like you might have 10 or 15 years ago. You just have an opportunity to see things. One of the examples I always use is back in 91. Kid Akeem Onifawash fought Robert Quiroga here in the United States. It was a pay-per-view. It was $9.95 on pay-per-view if you wanted to watch it. And it won Fight of the Year from a lot of U.S. publications. Semi-tragic ending because Onifawash almost died after the fight, but it was a great, great fight. And the crazy thing is, later on, when you had access to more of the world's fights and you could see some of the stuff that was posted on YouTube, I would argue that wasn't the Fight of the Year. The best fight from 1991 that I've ever seen. It wasn't Onifawash Quiroga. It wasn't James Toney and Mike McCallum. It was a fight at 112 pounds between Kitty Kasem and Jungkoo Chang. Jungkoo Chang is a Hall of Famer, great junior flyweight. He had moved up to flyweight. He had Kitty Kasem down, and then he got stopped in the 12th round of an absolute war. And in this day and age, right now, you would see that fight probably live. Here, I didn't see it until 15 years later when somebody pointed it out on YouTube, because I wasn't a tape trader in 91. I was a kid. And so, you know, the ability to see the entire world has been tremendous. And the entire world has caught on to Inoue. And Inoue fights almost all of his fights in Japan at odd hours for the rest of the world. But he's become an event for boxing fans to get up and watch no matter where they are in the world, because he's special. And the ability to see special, no matter where it is, no matter what weight it's at, is a tremendous asset to this era for all boxing fans. And that's why people should get excited about it in the US and the UK and anywhere else you can think of.
I love that. Great boxing is great boxing. And that's one of the reasons that it's just so fun to be able to talk to people who are so knowledgeable about everything that is going on. You know, you and I have covered the sport side by side for as long as we have. And yet every time we talk, I feel like I learn so much from you. And I hope that our listeners are able to do the same, not only here, but with your work. So before I let you go, do you want to tell people where they can follow you?
Absolutely. You can catch me anytime. I have a Substack now. It's called The Corner Stool, rolledboxing.substack.com. I just updated all of the champion stats and records. And so if you want to know who the champions are in the sport, what the records are for consecutive title defenses in the sport, I logged that. I'm slowly building an encyclopedia for the sport when I have time right now. I have two kids who are very busy. I spend a lot of time with them. I still do regular previews for the big fights. I'm also backloading some of my more interesting older articles, and I'm still working on historical research pieces that I can post for folks. There are some articles that are free for everybody. You can subscribe for the rest of it. I'd love to have you. Anybody that's listening out there, I'd love to have you as a reader. And you can post in the comments what you'd like to read, and I'm happy to oblige. So that's where you can find me out there.
And people definitely should. You have long been one of the best boxing writers around. A lot of people don't realize this, but you and Jake Donovan really built boxing scene, carried it on your backs. And so for people who appreciate good boxing writing, it's good to support good boxing writing. So that's Rolled Boxing, ROLD boxing, .substack.com. Cliff, it's always great chatting with you. Looking forward to the next time. Thank you for coming on.
Absolutely, Dave. Talk to you soon, buddy.
Well, that was a really fun conversation. I always love talking with Cliff. It's amazing how this sport, writing about the sport, being a fan of the sport, has led to friendships for me with other writers, with other boxing fans. I imagine it's been a similar experience for you.
Yeah, it is. And when you get to speak to people like you did there with Cliff, and their knowledge on particular areas and categories is just quite special, isn't it? Matt Christie's one for me, the former editor of Boxing News magazine. If you speak to Matt about the heavyweights, it blows your mind how much he knows and how much he can remember, like the finest of details. And Steve Bunce is another one of those who's been around the sport his whole working life. You can literally mention any name in world boxing and definitely British boxing, and then you've just got this most magnificent story which comes after it. So always a pleasure to speak to and build relationships with those types of people, isn't it?
It is. One of my favorite experiences with Cliff and Doug Fisher, the editor-in-chief of Ring Magazine, after the Boxing Writers Association of America dinner in New York City. And we all got together at Jimmy's Corner. That is a boxing-themed bar that is owned by the now-deceased boxing trainer Jimmy Glenn, so now by his family. And I'm just sitting at this small table in this very packed, tiny bar, listening to Doug and Cliff debate history with all the knowledge that they had. And it just was so much fun. So I'm really glad that Cliff was able to join us to break down the fights. Let's move on now, though, to talking about what's coming up this week. And I think the two big fights are the junior middleweight title fight between Bakhram Murtazaliev and Tim Tszyu. And then there's also the crossroads fight at 140 pounds between Adam Ziem and O'Hara Davies. The fight between Murtazaliev and Tszyu, we talked with Kathy Duva about this. That episode ran separately on our podcast network, so please give that a listen. I think that this is a huge fight for both men. Bakhram Murtazaliev doesn't have the name recognition, but he won his world title earlier this year versus Jack Colque, and he really needed that win because in a division that has the Sebastian Fendora, Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence, Tim Tszyu, Sergey Boachuk, Virgil Ortiz, if you don't have the connections that those guys do, you need some kind of leverage. Murtazaliev is signed with Main Events. They are a storied promoter, but they don't have those network connections. So the fact that he has this world title is why Tim Tszyu, who lost his belt to Fundora earlier this year and wants to get back in the picture, why this fight is being made, and it's being aired on Amazon's Prime Video. And this is also a big fight for Tszyu, who is going to be just as desperate to get those opportunities because the winner of this fight will move on to face any or many of those names that we mentioned. There's one other storyline that I think is really important, and that is more about the business of boxing. This is the first non-pay-per-view broadcast for PBC, for Premier Boxing Champions, on Amazon's Prime Video. And I mention that because the business of boxing does have a bearing on the fights that we get. HBO and Showtime were the two biggest broadcasters of fights in the United States. And when they both went under in recent years, that meant that there were fewer places to watch boxing. It's harder to make the big fights. And for PBC, when they lost Showtime, they were fortunate to end up on Amazon, but now they need to really get that proof of concept where they can put on the best fights. And for Amazon, try to get subscribers, try to get people to tune in and build the sport, build a following.
That's a really good observation, and this is the sort of fight which will get some good coverage. And I was looking for a documentary earlier on the Amazon Fire Stick, which I've got at home, and the big banner at the top of the Amazon Fire Stick homepage came up with this fight live on Prime TV. And you think how many millions and millions and millions of people who have got that setup and who would have seen that. And I just thought that's a good look for boxing, that is. And in fact, it's probably a better position to be in than they were when they had their was it Showtime, wasn't it? It was Showtime in the States when they had their Showtime broadcast deal.
Yeah, and I want all promoters and all networks to succeed, because if they don't, then boxing will continue. I don't want to say death spiral, but in the United States, it's just not as big as the sport once used to be. Which is why the biggest boxing event in the United States this year is still going to be Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul. There is one fight on the undercard that I'm interested in. It's a 2-fight undercard, and that's a junior middleweight prospect named Yoenis Tellez. He's originally from Cuba, so he'll be performing. He's one to watch. He's been featured a lot. He's not yet ready for these other big names at 154, but he's one to keep an eye out for. Let's talk about the other big fight, and that's taking place in the UK. And I believe it's at the Copper Box. That's Adam Azim versus O'Hara Davies. Sometimes we've got fighters who are friends who say that they're putting the friendship to the side and that they're going to be rivals. It looks like these are two friends who are remaining friends, but given their friendship, despite their friendship, given the stakes that are on the line, should we still expect some heated action between these two?
Yeah, I think so. This is also a really good fight, which has gone under the radar because Adam Azim is 11-0 and one of the most exciting prospects in the super lightweight division definitely in the UK, but coming up in Europe. And then O'Hara Davies is one of those fighters who's only lost to good people. His last fight was a loss to Ismael Barroso, but before that, his only other losses came from Jack Catterall and Josh Taylor. So that tells you all about the kind of level which he's fought at. And it's not like he's lost terribly to people either. Like when he's been in the fight, he's really been in the fight. So bringing those two together, that kind of young, electric style of Adam Azim, and then the experience and the really long, powerful arms of O'Hara Davies should make it an interesting watch.
I do think that there is some desperation for O'Hara Davies. While the two losses before were to Josh Taylor and Jack Catterall, Taylor by TKO and Catterall by decision, those were two of the best guys at 140. Taylor at that time was on his way up to becoming eventually the champion at 140. And Catterall, of course, is the guy who has given Taylor heck in 2 fights. This loss to Barroso is a legit contender despite his advanced age. But that was a 1-round drubbing for Davies. And because of that, another defeat for Davies could be really damaging for him. And so that's why I think despite the friendship, this is quite a crossroads fight, because Azim needs to have a recognizable name on his record in order to move forward to the next level. And Davies, despite their friendship, he doesn't want to be the fall guy.
Yeah, and that going back to that fight with Barroso, he just never allowed O'Hara Davies to get into the fight at all. But if I can, I just want to shout out a couple of fights or a couple of fighters on the undercard of that. So Dan Aziz, who in his last fight lost to Joshua Buatsi at Wembley this year. Again, I was fortunate enough to be there for that, and Joshua Buatsi was just a level above Dan Aziz, but there's lots to like about him. And he's just a very much a throwback fighter, and he's up against Louis Edmondson, and that's for the British light heavyweight vacant title, so that'd be good. And then Michael McKinson as well, who's actually quite a local lad to me. He's a Portsmouth-based fighter, and those in the US will remember his fight against Virgil Ortiz Jr., where he gave a good account of himself, but I think he broke a rib or something like that, and then had to pull out of the fight in the middle rounds. I can't quite remember. I've been punching the head too many times myself. But yeah, for those in the UK, that's a good show to watch. And if you can get it in the US, then some good people to watch there too.
I think I saw that Anthony Yarde is going to be back as well on the undercard. I don't see an opponent announced for him just yet. There's one other fight that I want to mention. I don't see a broadcast network in the United States for it yet, but that is the fight for the vacant IBF super middleweight title. We mentioned this earlier, and that is going to be William Skoll versus Vladimir Shishkin. While neither of these guys has really fought at the top level just yet, it'll be interesting to see with that world title how they fit into the picture at 168. So let's move on now and talk about our fighters of the week. Darren, a lot to talk about. Who's your fighter of the week?
So my fighter of the week is Michael McKinson, who I just mentioned. Not only because he's a local lad, but he's entertaining to watch because he's so slick and he's slippery, and he's become one of those fighters who is, what's the way to describe it? He is high risk, very low reward, because he's not the easiest person to beat, because he can make you miss and he can make you look silly. And he's just not the sort of fighter which you can look good up against. Not even Virgil Ortiz Jr. ended up looking very good against him. And because of that, and because of his style, because of the way that he fights, he's low reward. And that's why a lot of people avoid him. And it's frustrating because I spent quite a bit of time with McKinson over the years. I made a radio documentary about him for BBC Local Radio a few years ago, and his journey from basically the amateurs all the way up to fighting and headlining that show in America, and the stories of him fighting in smoke-filled rooms in working men's clubs to then being live on the zone to hundreds of thousands of people around the world. He's had a bit of a break at the ring because it's been so difficult to get him a fight. He's been in Philadelphia recently sparring with Boots Ennis, and he's just a really enjoyable fighter to watch. So he, for that reason, is my fighter of the week. Go and check him out and watch his fight this weekend. And before I finish, I remember now, in the States, Boxer have got a deal with Peacock TV. So you should be able to watch any of the Boxer shows on Peacock TV in the States.
Yeah, it's been a treat having that extra network to watch some of these fights taking place in the UK. And I really enjoy that these cards start at like 2 o'clock Eastern time on a Saturday afternoon, which is a lot better than staying up till 2 a.m. to watch some of the pay-per-views that we've had. I complain, but I know that you UK boxing fans are doing this overnight thing a lot.
Painful.
And you'll be doing that for the December 14th fight between Gervonta Davis and Lamont Roach, which leads into my fighter of the week, which is Stephen Fulton. Fulton, you may recall, was the unified title holder at junior featherweight, the first of 2 title holders that Naoya Inoue demolished on the way to becoming the undisputed champion. Fulton recently came back as a featherweight, fought Carlos Castro just the other month, and now he's going to be back on the undercard to Tank versus Lamont Roach with a rematch against Brandon Figueroa. And this is just par for the course for Fulton. He, as a prospect, as a contender, as a title holder, just takes on tough challenge after tough challenge. On his way up, he fought 3 undefeated fighters in a row, fought Isaac Avalar, Arnold Kagai, fought Angelo Leo to win his first world title at 122, then fought Brandon Figueroa, and that was just, in 2021, that was a very close, very entertaining fight where Figueroa just came forward with volume punching and forced Fulton to really try to lace in a bunch of counter shots. So Fulton took that by majority decision, and then 2 fights later, traveled overseas to face Naoya Inoue. He went to Japan even though he was the title holder because he was all about that smoke. So here he is about that smoke again in a very good fight. Figueroa was recently upgraded to become the full WBC title holder at 126 because Ray Vargas has an injury. So this fight will be for a big world title. And we were talking about how much more entertaining the men's featherweight division is getting. This is one fight that is going to send the winner forward.
Some of my favourite fighters, and this sounds exactly the case with your fighter of the week, is those fighters who have that phrase in their heads that don't even need to say it out loud, and that is, have gum shield and gloves, will travel. And they don't care where they go, whose backyard they fight in. They just want the opportunity, don't they? You're just speaking about Lamont Roach there. Before I forget, I got asked to be a part of a panel for a boxing YouTube show the other day with Fergal McCrory, who was Lamont Roach's or one of his most recent opponents, and also a couple of other boxing journalists as well. It's called Hustle Hard Media Boxing YouTube. So go and check that out. It was good to catch up with those guys and get a difference of opinions from all sorts of different walks of life in the sport of boxing.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. We will be back next week to talk about the results for Zhu versus Murtazaliev, for Adam Azim versus O'Hara Davies, and also to preview the big fight taking place October 26th in Manchester with Jack Catterall versus Regis Prograis. Follow us on social media. You can follow me on Twitter or X at FightingWords2, and you can follow the podcast at United Boxing Pod. Darren, how can people find you?
You can get me at Darren Rees _ on X, Instagram, and on TikTok. I got confused between Twitter and X then, thinking they were two different platforms entirely, but I soon remembered.
And please do send your questions and comments. We're happy to talk about them on the show. And please remember to subscribe. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.